there are only two this evening, I understand. So the two panelists are Dr. Anup Burman, who is Director of Medical Education and former head of the department at Medical College Hospital, Guwahati, in the Department of Nephrology. Professor Anup is one of our eminent panelists. And Dr. Shyam Bihari Bansal, who is a director at Medanta, the Nephrology, Kidney and Neurology Institute at Medanta. I understand that Dr. Himanshu was not able to join us.
There will be panel discussions.
I understand Dr. Himanshu was not able to join us. So the questions that we have planned for Dr. Himanshu, one of the questions I propose to ask Professor Agarwal, and one of the questions I propose to ask Professor Manisha. So that's the way we will go. The two questions which were planned for Dr. Himanshu will be given to the two eminent chairpersons. So, Dr. Anup, sir, the questions for you are on the screen. The first question is, what is the relevance of when we say a low protein diet? When our patients are already slightly on the lower nutritional scale, what is the relevance of a low protein diet in our patients to maintain kidney function? And therefore, sir, what would your advice be? What nutrition advice would we give our patients? Over to you, sir.
So, good evening to all my esteemed teachers, and good evening to my post-director today. First of all, I must thanks Professor K.L. Gupta for inviting me as a part of this panel discussion today. So, in this era, my first question is, what is the relevance of low protein diets in a country like India? The diet is a prescription of a balanced diet is a very, very paramount importance in a clinical nephrology practices. And what we are doing by whatever we call it customary or by default, we Indians are basically vegetarian by and large. So and there are ample of evidence that the restriction of protein intake for the disease retardations, we know all. But nutritional assessment and monitoring of and the interventions are clinical components of core for a patient with a chronic kidney disease. Nutrition plays an important role in the treatment of hypertension, diabetes, chronic kidney disease, and lipid abnormalities, etc. And as the GFR deteriorates, so there is a retention of nitrogenous waste products. This is simply repetition of these things. So so we have to restrict the protein intake. So this is one of the important is that we monitor the protein intake. So we go by the KDOQI guidelines. What is suggested that it should be protein intake should be 0.6 to 1.75 grams per kg body weight, and in this CKD stage 1 to 4. And when it reaches the CKD 5 and D on dialysis or on RRT, 1.2 grams per kg body weight. And low protein diet, as you know, there is ample of evidence. It can deter the disease progression, as high protein diet can cause increased interglomerular pressures, and also there's increased hyperfiltration of the glomerula, which can eventually may lead to further damage of the kidney glomerular structures, leading to chronic kidney disease or to aggravate the existing chronic kidney disease. But a balanced and individualized dietary approach based on low protein diet should be elaborated in a periodic dietitian counseling or diet counseling by an expert and in surveillance to optimize the CKD management to avoid protein energy malnutrition. In Indian context, I think this is one of the very important aspects, because traditionally in Indian diet, the proteins are less in compared to the Western diet. So if you go for more restriction of proteins, eventually it can cause it can lead to a protein acidosis. He or she may not be a healthy recipient for a transplantation. So the protein restriction, although it is required, but it should be always a balance. So my opinion that in Indian context, already we are taking not much protein in compared to the Western dieters, Western. So the protein restriction should be very, very careful about. While you advise for the protein restriction, it should be very, very obvious. And always it should be, a dietitian should always counsel the patients for their protein intake. So, and that's all about my opinion. But there are about the low protein diet, if you look at the US study, the low protein diet is a means of slowing of security progression is not largely prescribed in very clinical practice in US. That means they have never introduced the low protein diet in their diet. One main obstacle to implementation of low protein diet is a big gap in the protein intake between the amount of commendation and from the guideline and what is actually consumed. So this is one of the very important aspects while prescribing a diet. I think my question is very clear that the protein restriction is required, but at how much it has to be individualized, and then restriction it should be by a dietitian. It should be counseled by a dietitian how much to be prescribed and what type of protein should be prescribed. That's all about fast questions.
Thank you, Professor Anu. That was excellent. In a country where most people eat very less protein, the value of protein restriction has to be really carefully looked at and individualized. Thank you very much, sir. So next question to you is, which of the GFR equations available should we employ in our patients? And when would we say we should employ cystatin C GFR?
GFR is arguably one of the most important parameters in human physiology, and it plays a very fundamental role in clinical nephrology. Both in clinical and research, a comparison of GFR between and within the subjects are of vital importance. Now, if I go by the National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Disease, this is NIDDK, it strongly encourages the clinical laboratories routinely to estimate the GFR. And in our we always go by the creatinine-based eGFR. And an estimated eGFR or eGFR is calculated for the serum creatinine using by isotope dilation mass spectrometry. We call it IDMS system. And then equation what's available as of today are very, very two important. One is of MDRD, and we all know about CKD EPI. And both are equally effective, equally accurate. But when the creatinine is more than 60, perhaps the CKD EPI equation is more, and when the GFR is less than 60 ml, then MDRD equation is more accurate. But when MDRD CKD equal are equally accurate when the GFR is less than 60 ml. Again, age factor is also important. When age below 18 years, usually we do not recommend these two formulations, and above 70, but even 70 also MDRD can be accepted as a mode of calculation. But for the children or for below the age, we always go by the bedside Stewart's equation, which is commonly used by the pediatric nephrologists. And one trial on a direct comparison, MDRD and CKD EPI, these equations are superior to our that is a classical, that is CNG formulation. So nowadays we do not go by the CNG formulation, either we go by the MDRD or CKD EPI. So these are the common equations what we use in our clinical practices, and these are mostly the creatinine based. But these creatinine based may not be accurate in certain clinical situations, like when in a pregnant woman, in a patient with a very serious comorbid conditions, when a patient is a hospitalized patient with a impaired renal functions, patient is an amputee, or patient is a paraplegic, or patient is a hefty body mass or very obese, and patient with a very wasting disease, a muscle wasting disease, or severely malnourished, In those circumstances, perhaps creatinine-based EGFR may not be accurate. In those circumstances, probably the cystatin-based EGFR is accurate. That's all about. If you have any other questions, please ask. Or my answer. If I am not complete my answer, kindly my other members can, complete my answer, please.
I have a very practical question to ask you, sir. When we have what is the relevance of the GFR in the equations? I have a question of an example on the screen. A 60-year-old lady with a height.
Yeah, please go ahead. Please. I'm not audible.
Her GFR is 18.47 by 1.73 meters squared, but actual GFR is only 13.91. So when we have a discrepancy of actual GFR versus the GFR by 1.73 meters squared, because we have people who are not very well built, our body surface area is not 1.73 meters squared. What are the practical implications of this conundrum when we face our patients?
To this way, I think this example what you have given, and the practical implication in this, I think it's based on not exactly the body surface area. It should be with the total body water. What the literature says that this estimation of GFR in terms of what we are doing is a 1.73 square meter body surface area. Rather, it should have been the total body water or total extracellular fluid volume. That will give us an accurate estimation of GFR, in my opinion, probably, if I am not wrong. Do you have any opinions, or any other ST members can explain better way?
My point was, sir, in one level the person is CKD stage 5, the other one is stage 4. How alarmed should we be when we see these values?
Yes, I get a pardon, please. Any questions, sir?
When the GFR is calculated for the sake of putting into stages of GFR, she is actually stage 4. But when we look at the actual GFR, the GFR is only 13.91. At this point, should we tell the patient, because of the size of the body habitus, the GFR is actually lower than compared to a Western person, and therefore it may progress more? We don't have any evidence. What do you think, sir?
I probably will not be able to answer you this question. It should be just. Can you please explain, because I'm not getting actually the question here. It's not very clear to me, your question. Please.
Dr. Santosh.
Yeah, so please, sir, please, can you please answer to this question a little?
No, actually the point is that I will say I will not bother whether it is 18 ml or 13 ml. These numbers are actually more for the research point of view, but for an individual patient care, other than the numbers, what actually problem patient clinically is having is much more important than just a difference of 3 or 4 ml GFR, whether it is estimated from a different equation. So many times it is better not to label patient in front of a patient that you are stage 4 or 5, because really it creates so much problem in say in patient who are not psychologically very stable. For them, saying stage 5 is really detrimental in their day-to-day life, while in true sense it doesn't matter too much of a difference, neither in terms of a management nor in terms of a deciding whether person should be taken for the renal replacement therapy. I think that what Santosh is, if Santosh want to add anything else.
No, sir. I was just saying a similar thing, that rather than the value, the clinical situation, we must look at and use it only for labeling, for classification alone. Thank you very much, sir. I think go on to the next set of questions.
Please.
Next set of questions for Dr. Shyam Bihari Bansal. Shyamji, are you on?
Yes, I am on.
Yeah. So the two questions on your screen, they're actually kind of a composite set of questions. In our day-to-day practice, what would we say, what is the impact of these congenital anomalies of Kakut or Kakut? And when do you think that we should screen them, screen for them? We would not be able to screen every situation. So when would you have a early, a preponderance for screening?
Santosh, so I'm not the right person for these answering these questions, because I am not a pediatric nephrology, and pediatric nephrologists are usually they are dealing with these problems on day-to-day basis, because we usually see patients who are more than 16 or 18 years of age. So I can't really comment about the people who present early. But if you see in adults less than 25 years of age, about 20% to 25% of patients have CKD of unknown origin. And in these patients, many of them have steroid and nephrotic syndrome and other abnormalities. So in these patients, you can probably go ahead for the genetic testing of these patients to know. And for these patients, as pointed out by Dr. Vasudevan, that you can do, because many of these are actually autosomal recessive disorders, except for the polycystic kidney disease, which are autosomal polycystic kidney disease. So in these patients, you can probably go for maybe clinical exome sequencing, or sometime you can go with whole exome sequencing also. But then again, the problem with whole exome sequencing is that you detect many of the abnormality or genetic abnormality which are of unknown significance. So if you are aware with any disease, like if there's a polycystic kidney disease, it's better to go with Sanger sequencing and then the next generation sequencing, rather than going for the whole genome sequencing, unless you are totally unclear about the origin of the disease. Means like if the patient has unknown cause of chronic kidney disease. Obviously, impact of the congenital abnormalities, like if the abnormalities are like if somebody has agenesis or hypogenesis or vesicular reflex, the impact is there, and then later on these patients are prone to develop CKD and end-stage kidney disease. And if we can correct these abnormalities, the early stages, especially immediately after the birth of the child, because as Dr. Vasudevan also mentioned, that in many of these abnormalities in utero, they are functional, especially the VUR or some hydronephrosis or something. But after the birth, it is a residual things, and then you need to correct the abnormalities like vesicular, like posterior rectal wall. So you need to do the screening early and correct these things. And for screening, as I already mentioned, that we screen with these patients with various genetic testing, and depending on these the result, we can then classify the patients.
Thank you. I think that's a fair enough statement, that we have an index of suspicion, look for them, try to rectify them, and in certain circumstances, like we heard in the elegant lecture, we do screening. Thank you very much. In the next set of questions, can the screen change, please? Yeah, next set of questions are from the basis of Professor Amit's lecture regarding the HIF inhibitors for anemia management. So the first question to Dr. Sanjay and the second question to Dr. Manisha. The first one is, what is the most exciting part of using the HIF inhibitors for anemia management, and what are the gray areas that we still need a lot of clarity on? Dr. Sanjay Agrawal.
Santosh, at the outset, I must say that I haven't used these drug, neither is not available in market, and I was not also part of the trial which was being conducted. But the most fascinating thing is that these drugs are oral, so that is the best part, that all those logistic issue of keeping the injectable EPO in a cold chain and giving injection 2 or 3 times in a week, particularly for a pre-dialysis patient who is not coming for the dialysis in the hospital setting, cost of the nursing who gives the injection, all those factors will be taken care of. And another thing is that the target hemoglobin and the complexity of the cardiovascular and the stroke complication related to higher target of hemoglobin, we are still not very sure whether it is the hemoglobin level itself or it is the erythropoietin resistance and the higher use of erythropoietin which is actually responsible for these side effects. So once we will shift to the oral drugs, then all those side effects we expect are going to be negligible or maybe taken care of. But simultaneously, these drugs, we don't have a long-term safety profile is still known. Even in the trials also, the toxicity of hepatotoxicity and pulmonary hypertension and these things are already there. So once these are passed in phase 3 trial and comes into the marketing and clinical use, then the long-term side effect will be known, and that will be important because these are the type of the drug which needs to be used for a long period. So that is still we have to wait and see what is the long-term safety profile. I think these two are the advantages, and is still clarity which is needed on these drugs.
What do you think about the effect of on iron metabolism, sir?
Although this claim that iron metabolism is better maintained with hypoxia and this will better as compared to injectable erythropoietin, I think we need little more larger sample size and more studies and long-term studies to know much more clarity.
Thank you, sir.
I just want to add one more point which is unrelated to the question but related to Dr. Amit's talk. There is iron with the name of ferric oxyhydroxide, and that is recommended, as the company is recommending, to be used in a dialysis patient, hemodialysis patient only, because that iron is to be mixed with the dialysate fluid. And the initial studies has shown that the iron toxicity by injectable iron and those things will be almost nil in this iron preparation, which is still under trial, and it was submitted to the Controller of India recently for doing the trial in the country for marketing purposes. So that if it really comes, that will be a little different as compared to the iron being used as of now.
Santosh, can I make a point about this, some gray areas about this HIF? Because the main concern about the use of these agents is because they act at various actually receptors in many parts of the body. And one of the concern is they stimulate VEGF. And that's why they can promote the proliferations. So it is too cautiously used in a patient with diabetic retinopathy and the patient with cystic diseases, because they can actually increase the critical risk of increase the growth of the cyst. Another important factor, the tumors which have actually these receptors there, and these tumors, there is a theoretical risk of progression, although it has not been proven, but there is some concern in terms of use of these agents, and so that is still some of the gray area which require clarity in these patients.
Thank you, Shyamji. Manisha ma'am, question for you. If we were to have HIF inhibitors available now, which group of patients would you recommend using it? Should you give the patient the autonomy to choose the ESAs which we are using all these years, or should we prescribe these drugs by ourselves knowing its benefit, or should we tell the patient the side effects, potential side effects, and allow them to choose? What's your take on it, ma'am?
So that's a very interesting question, what you've put, Dr. Santosh. So these inhibitors are now in clinical use in Japan, but not in India. Japan and China, I think. And in India, we had the opportunity to work with these molecules. So as the speaker has alluded to, and the previous the panelists have also alluded to, you have certain important features which are properties of these HIF stabilizers or PHIs, and they are that they do not, I mean, they just increase the level of endogenous erythropoietin. So they don't, I mean, cause the erythropoietin to go up terribly. And then they have a very good effect on the iron metabolism, that sometimes you may not need to give iron, because they, apart from improving the iron absorption from the gut, they also decrease the level of hepcidin, which does not occur with the ESAs. So these are two important things, apart from no need of cold chain, these being oral drugs. So they are very important points with these drugs. In addition, they are thought to lower the levels of cholesterol as well. But we have to remember that every good thing comes with a bad point to it, and this has been alluded to, because increased levels of VEGF is a major problem. And then you have tumors, you have to be careful about proliferative retinopathy, you have to be careful about patients with polycystic kidney disease. So the polycystic kidney disease were not excluded from these trials, but there was a point of special mention and special follow-up of these patients, even in the trials which were done in India. In addition, the patients with proliferative retinopathy, there was a caution that you have to take a clearance and all that. So these are the groups of patients where I personally won't be liking to use them. In addition to these things, see, I think it's too early for us to let the patient choose, because still the data is still in the process of coming. We are, sometimes the dose adjustments, the hemoglobin rises so fast that you have to curtail the dose, sometimes stop the dose with these drugs. So I think we need more experience. The phase 3 studies are going on. I would want the whole data to come before we act on these drugs. Then, the answer to your question is, as of now, I would not, like the patient to choose, we would in fact choose for them. Another important point is regarding the MACE events. The ESAs, the main negative point is the cardiovascular risks, the thrombosis, strokes. But with these drugs, it has been shown that with the roxadustat in the trials, it's been shown that as compared to the active comparator in those studies, the MACE events were curtailed by 30%. So that's what was shown. So maybe those patients who are at high risk for MACE events, high risk for access thrombosis, those who have severe hypertension, or those who do not respond to ESA, or the hyper-responsive to ESA is there, maybe those patients, the doctor would like to choose these drugs. They have been shown to be safe in incident dialysis patients as well as in stable dialysis patients. That's what the data has shown so far. But as of now, all good things, I think we need more experience. I won't be confident letting the patient choose as of now on their own. For initial part, when we are using this drugs, I would be comfortable prescribing, knowing all this, keeping all this in mind, and then prescribing. Later on, as we have more experience, and maybe after post-marketing surveys and phase 4 studies are done and all, maybe that could be the point where the patient could take a lead in choosing. That's my opinion.
Thank you, ma'am. I think that's a very elucidated reply. So, as ma'am said, we would choose for the patient, be selective, not be hasty in giving it to everybody, go with the old known devils rather than unknown angels, choose for people who are at high risk for vascular events, and see how it pans out in the next few years and then make a decision. I think that brings us to the end of the panel discussion. I'd like to thank all my senior colleagues who participated in this panel discussion. Thank you very much.